When Epcot's Innoventions opened in the park in 1994, it brought with it a host of exhibits showcasing the technology of the future. The idea was that as new technology was developed over time, companies could bring these developments to Walt Disney World to demo to visiting guests. But as the years went on and companies began to drop out of Innoventions, initially to be replaced by blander exhibits, and then by nothing, what resulted was a slow, sad decline of the pavilion, as it fell into partial abandonment. And when Disney finally completed its eventual replacement just this year, it didn't do much to remedy the decline of the area. So let's take a look at the life of Disney's Innoventions, its promise, its neglect, its shortcomings, and the failures of what came after it. Epcot Center's CommuniCore Pavilion opened with the park in 1982, as the main part of its central hub. CommuniCore would serve in part as a further display for Epcot sponsors, but also as a way to tie together the many ideas of Future World into one location, through a collection of hands-on exhibits, many of which related to other Future World attractions. This way, guests could learn about energy production at the Universe of Energy, and then go next door to CommuniCore to try and power a light bulb by hand, or see a massive rock full of oil. The pavilion itself was split across two buildings, named CommuniCore East and West respectively, each with a corridor running through the middle, allowing access further into Future World. The buildings were designed in such a way so that they could be expanded outwards for future exhibits over the years, although in reality, only one of these expansions ever ended up happening, and were also built with double high ceilings to allow for a planned people mover to run through them, a plan that was eventually cancelled. In CommuniCore East, guests could visit the Travel Port, where they could learn about different locations to visit around the world. The Electronic Forum, a news hub playing different news TV channels, featuring a show where guests could vote on questions about current events, and the Energy Exchange, containing a variety of Exxon-sponsored exhibits themed around energy, like a model of an oil drilling platform, an interactive demonstration of photovoltaic cells, and that giant oil rock I mentioned. Really a 30,000-pound oil shale, on display to show the oil needed to power a car for a year. And CommuniCore East's main exhibit was called Computer Central, where guests could try out interactive games from the emerging world of early 80s computer technology, including a behind-the-scenes glimpse at the massive control center that powered the park through the musical show The Astuter Computer Review. Across the plaza in CommuniCore West, the main exhibit was named FutureCom, an area dedicated to communications technology, dominated by a sculpture built out of forms of communication named the Fountain of Information, and also housing demos on advancements from the world of phone communications, such as an early version of video conferencing. CommuniCore also housed a handful of smaller areas, alongside two restaurants named the Stargate Restaurant and Sunrise Terrace, and Epcot's largest gift shop named the Centaurium. Sometimes referred to as Epcot Center's Main Street USA, CommuniCore worked in much the same way as the entrance to Disneyland and Magic Kingdom, housing a large number of smaller attractions intended to give a sense of the broader themes and ideas of the park. While it may seem dry by today's standards, a lot of the hands-on displays featured pretty exciting technology for the time, particularly in Computer Central, as many people in the early 80s didn't yet own their own computer. And CommuniCore also stayed true to one of Epcot's key goals of education, creating a way for guests to refresh and retain the information they'd learned of Future World's other attractions. Over the decade, CommuniCore would adapt to evolving trends, as many of the areas were slightly updated to reflect advancements in technology, most notably a shift in the pavilion featuring more and more PCs. But once the 80s had come to an end, CommuniCore did find itself facing questions over its continued relevancy, mainly from one person at Disney. In the early 90s, then Disney CEO Michael Eisner was seeking an overhaul of much of Walt Disney World. As mentioned in my video on the terrible 1999 retheme of Journey into Imagination, Eisner felt strongly that the resort was becoming stale and outdated, and needed to undergo significant changes if it was to hope to appeal to the theme park goers of the 1990s. Eisner felt that Disney was viewed as too quaint and cutesy by many people, and that it should begin opening attractions more in line with current trends that would appeal to broader audiences beyond the strictly family demographic. Partially motivated by his teenage son declaring that Disney was a place for babies, Eisner directed the company to overhaul Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland, resulting in attractions like the much edgier extraterrestrial alien encounter, and around the same time, he also started turning his attention towards Epcot. In 1994, Epcot Center dropped the center from its name and renamed itself Epcot 94. And at the beginning of that year, CommuniCore would close its doors for a 5-month transformation to modernize the pavilion, reopening on July 1st under the new name Innoventions.
Then you'll fast forward to the immediate future at the vast new Innoventions, an amazing showcase of what's new and what's to come. Here you'll be among the first to see, touch, and play with all the inventions that will soon change your life.
It's like 1,000 Sega games all under one roof. They're everywhere.
Innoventions, a combination of the words innovation and inventions, would carry much of the same DNA as CommuniCore. But rather than being an educational showcase of industrial and enterprise-based technologies, it would instead carry a much stronger focus on consumer technology. Eisner had recently visited CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, and felt that Disney needed something similar. And he also felt that this would be more relevant to guests, as they get a chance to try out cutting-edge products they'd soon be using in their daily lives. And so CommuniCore was gutted, and the exhibits inside were replaced with several smaller ones, all carrying more of that trade show feel. The interiors were decorated to that flashier, more 90s look Eisner wanted the park to be appealing to, rather than the subdued look of CommuniCore, and a new, bright, crowded neon sign was built at the entrance. The pavilion was still separated across 2 buildings, Innoventions East and West. Innoventions East now contained exhibits sponsored by Apple, General Electric, General Motors, Oracle, Honeywell, Masco, and Hammacher Schlemmer. And Innoventions West housed sponsors AT&T, Discover Magazine, IBM, Videonics, Lego, and Sega. Most of these were product showcases, like AT&T's demo of wristwatch and video phones, or Apple's display of laptops. But there were some more interactive exhibits. Lego's area let guests build from its Dacta toy line, the old name for the umbrella of educational toys that included the likes of Lego Technic. And one of the big draws of Innoventions in 1994 was the Sega Arcade, which housed over 140 video games on arcade machines and home consoles, like the Genesis and the soon-to-be-released 32X. Beyond the corporate showcases though, there were also a handful of Disney-designed exhibits. In Innoventions West, there was the clumsily named Eclectronics, a sort of mini showcase of assorted gadgets that guests could pick up and use, alongside an incredibly creepy animatronic show featuring a skinless animatronic named Alectronic, who would sing, tell jokes, and do bad impressions.
Anyway, what I really want to know is... Are you feeling alright?
There was also a Bill Nye the Science Guy multimedia show where he spoke about inventing, and the top of Innoventions West housed perhaps the most exciting attraction of the time, the Walt Disney Imagineering Labs. Billed as a preview of upcoming Disney theme park technology, this was a short presentation of what was then cutting-edge 3D computer animation, ending with a demo of a VR headset, a giant head-mounted display, incredibly novel for the time, which was so heavy it had to hang down from the ceiling, allowing one guest per show to experience a 3D simulation of a flying carpet ride through Agrabah. The Centaurium gift shop survived the redo, but the Stargate restaurant became the neon-clad electric umbrella, and the Sunrise Terrace became the Fountain View Bakery and the Pasta Piazza Ristorante. While some nowadays may feel that Innoventions represented a significant downgrade to its predecessor with its egregious 90s design, the redo proved to be quite popular, as guests came to try out the latest products that were on display. And Innoventions was able to keep up with its cutting-edge ideals perhaps more easily than CommuniCore had done, as many of the companies that had signed up to rent spaces in the pavilion did so on short 2-year leases, allowing for frequent updates. In 1998, Innoventions West opened Ice Station Cool, a polar exploration-themed Coca-Cola gift shop, which would last until 2005 when it was refurbished into Club Cool. And 1999 and the approach of the new millennium would see the first major redesign for Innoventions, as it would adopt a highway theme, adorning the inside with road signs and a cartoon highway on the ground, with the entrance sign now bearing the subtitle The Road to Tomorrow. With the rise of the internet, many of the products on display would be geared heavily towards that, with exhibits like AT&T's broadband connection and Disney's Internet Zone hosting a demo of the video game Toontown. Motorola would join Innoventions with the Dreamport, featuring animatronic robot Starnak, a very similar character to Tomorrowland's Timekeeper. The House of Innoventions would welcome guests to a walk-through House of the Future, and the latest in home theatre tech would be shown off in the ultimate home theatre experience. The Centaurium gift shop would finally undergo a refurbishment, being reopened as Mouse Gear, with a very 90s, kind of steampunk-esque design, very similar to that which Tomorrowland had undergone several years earlier. And Innoventions would finally get rid of the eternally creepy Electronic, and replace him 2 years later for a smaller, friendlier robot named Tom Morrow 2.0, who would act as a mascot for the Pavilion. The second and final major retheme would happen gradually throughout the 2000s, as the sponsors of the late 90s left Innoventions and new ones took their place. But it would officially happen around 2007, when the Innoventions logo was changed to fit the new design aesthetics at the time. The Road to Tomorrow tagline was dropped, although the floor did remain, and many of the new exhibits would show a shift away from tech showcases towards the more educational goals of the Pavilion. One of the most major exhibits of this era was Where's the Fire, sponsored by Liberty Mutual Home Insurance. This was a screen-based game where guests could score points by finding as many fire hazards as possible in different rooms of a house. And another exhibit was Stormstruck, a storm preparedness area with a section teaching about essential items to prepare for a storm, and a 4D show teaching about hurricane preparedness for homes, where a simulation of a suburban neighborhood during a storm would play, showcasing how different techniques can be used to protect homes against damage. During this era, Innoventions would also get its first ever ride of a sort, with the opening of the Sum of All Thrills, sponsored by, of all things, defense contractor and weapons manufacturer Raytheon. Here, guests could design their own roller coaster and then ride through a simulation of it through the use of a giant robotic arm. Far and away the most popular thing across the whole of Innoventions. Innoventions as a whole had so many different exhibits over its lifespan that it's impossible to go over each one in detail without making this video unnecessarily long. But while the rapid changes of Innoventions did allow it to stay more relevant, its short leases did also make it far easier for companies to stop sponsoring the Pavilion once the initial hype for it had died down. Companies like Apple and Lego left Innoventions in the 90s after only a few years. Sega, which had a large space in the Pavilion when it first opened, eventually transformed their area into the video games of tomorrow, but finally left around the new millennium when it had its own financial issues around the launch of the Dreamcast, with Disney replacing the video game side of the Pavilion with a showcase for its own games through Disney Interactive. And while the internet-focused retheme of the late 90s did see some new companies sign on, by the mid to late 2000s, most of the big technology companies, with the exception of IBM, had disappeared from Innoventions. Their spaces were filled in turn mostly by insurance companies, non-profit organizations, and infrastructure companies. Still sponsors that provided educational exhibits, but perhaps not the same exciting view of the future Disney had hoped for. Instead of trying out the newest video phone or cutting-edge VR simulation, the visitors of the 2000s were now learning about waste management. I guess this one is actually still a technology showcase, but one of my favorite examples of the weird changes to Innoventions in the early 2000s is when the radiology exhibit closed. The dome that once housed its video segment was shut, and the surrounding area was repurposed into a training area for the hot new toy of the time, the Segway. And in my opinion, this move away from a tech showcase towards these blander exhibits is really where the downturn started for Innoventions. It had never been the most popular part of the park, even in the days of CommuniCore, But by the time the 2010s rolled around, for many guests it essentially just served as a cut through to the other parts of Future World. People just passed by, not bothering to stop in any of the exhibits, and attendance started sliding far below what it had been in the 90s. Surprisingly though, it still did receive a handful of updates around this time. A new House of Tomorrow named the Vision House opened in 2012, and that year also brought Habit Heroes, a screen-based show and shooting game about the importance of healthy eating, exercise, and breaking bad habits, told through a superhero story. And an attraction that was almost immediately closed for a year of retooling after it drew criticism for its depiction of unhealthy habits as villains, with some claiming it encouraged the bullying of overweight children. But these additions didn't do much to draw guests into Innoventions, as it grew emptier and emptier. The remaining exhibits, with their mismatch of conservation, some technology, and home insurance, I guess, continued life as a now often forgotten part of Epcot. And as exhibits came to the end of their short leases, rather than being replaced by something else, many of them now would just be sealed off, with nothing to go in their place. And so Innoventions became even emptier and even sadder. It was clear that the Pavilion didn't have much life left in it. In 2015, Disney suddenly announced that Innoventions West would close in May, as they seek to use the space for as of yet unannounced new projects. The area was walled off, but the remainder of the building was still being used for a character meet and greet area, a Starbucks, and an art store. And so the remains of Innoventions West were just left behind these temporary construction walls to decay in plain sight. The loss of Innoventions West spelled trouble for Innoventions East. As the leases ran out on its side of the pavilion, more and more exhibits closed and were replaced with nothing, as the area became, effectively, Disney's dead mall. In 2016, Habit Heroes, Stormstruck, and Innoventions' only real draw in its later years, the Sum of All Thrills, all closed, and again were not demolished, but just abandoned behind those construction walls. For some reason, Disney did actually still open new exhibits the following year, named Colortopia and the Spectaculab. And of course, IBM was still around as it had been since 1994. Thanks, IBM. But the weird combination of brand new things next to abandoned, never to be replaced things made these new additions feel incredibly strange. It seemed as though the pavilion was being kept on life support by Disney, just operating in a minimal capacity until they could finalize plans to do a proper replacement. And by the end of the 2010s, this is exactly what would happen. In 2017, Disney showed early plans for a major overhaul of the Future World section of Epcot that would, among other things, change out the ride Ellen's Energy Adventure for a new Guardians of the Galaxy themed roller coaster, and transform the central hub of the park into a maze of ornamental gardens. In 2019, they showed the finalized versions of these plans, revealing that after years of living in a limbo state, Innoventions was to be removed. The central hub was to become the centerpiece of a new land named World Celebration. Innoventions East would receive new shops and restaurants, and Innoventions West would be completely demolished. In its place would be the new Dreamers Point area at the park, and spectacular concept art detailed the gardens, fountains, and new 3-tiered building that would go in the area, serving as a new festival center for the park. In September of that year, construction work began to transform the center of Epcot, and slowly over several months, the West building was torn down, as, ironically, yet more temporary walls dominated the center of Epcot, as they had done for the last decade. At the time, many were hopeful for the transformation of the area. Innoventions had become so tired by that point that any change was a good change. And thankfully, the concept art of Dreamers Point looked like it would be a really welcome aesthetic upgrade. Unfortunately though, the following year, construction would be delayed, as the Disney company and the world entered an economic downturn as a result of the global pandemic. Disney scaled back many of its offerings as cost-cutting began, and some of what had been promised in the Epcot overhaul, such as the Play Pavilion, was paused or completely cancelled. When construction finally started picking back up again, the plans had changed from what was originally announced. The promised festival centre, the only actual new building in the project, was scrapped, leaving just the garden and the new interiors at the east building. In 2021, the first parts of the new hub began a staged opening, as a new gift shop named the Creation Shop and a relocated Club Cool both started operations in the old Innoventions East. And in 2022, the second half of the East building was reopened as the Connections Cafe and the Connections Eatery. That year, Disney also unveiled a new version of the promised festival centre, now named CommuniCore Hall, a throwback to the original pavilion in the area, promising to serve as an exciting new exhibition and gallery space. At the end of 2023, Dreamers Point and the now named World Celebration Gardens opened, including a statue of Walt overlooking the area, and the new attraction The Journey of Water, a Moana-inspired walkthrough exhibit educating guests about the water cycle. And finally, after 5 years of on-again, off-again development, in 2024, the last of the walls came down in the centre of Epcot. Innoventions was fully removed, and CommuniCore Hall, the final part of the overhaul, was open to the public. And immediately, guests started asking, is this really it? Now that construction was fully complete, and the entire project could be viewed as a whole, it became apparent that the place was now just empty. The new additions were devoid of any character, they looked incredibly cheap and lifeless, and it seemed so ridiculous that Disney had really taken 5 years to make this. Comparisons were made between the concept art and the reality of what had been built, showing that even more had been cut back from the already cut back project. CommuniCore Hall in particular came under intense criticism for just how much of nothing it was. An empty hallway with a scattering of tables and chairs. If the death of Innoventions had been sad, what came after it was just embarrassing. And that's the word that was used in many places to describe the updates, especially at a time when Disney's main competition, Universal, had been making massive strides with the construction of Epic Universe. Celebration Gardens and everything that came with it were emblematic of the perceived lack of care by Disney to build anything that might actually stand a chance of being more than an empty, lifeless space filler. This criticism of the area is still going on right now. Recently, with the start of Epcot's Food and Wine Festival, CommuniCore Hall has been used as an event space for the first time, and it still just looks empty and terrible. If I had to give some praise for Epcot's new hub, I'd say that I do think the garden area specifically is an upgrade to the weird canopy that existed throughout the 2000s, and I guess all the buildings do now carry a consistent, sleek, clean design to them, with a lot of natural light, the Connections Cafe and the Creation Shop being the best of these. But it's far too easy to make a so-called clean design when you're just being cheap. The minimalism of modern Disney feels far more like it's being done for cost-cutting reasons than aesthetic ones. And regardless of whether you preferred Innoventions or CommuniCore, they at least both had a good sense of character, which is something that's now completely lost in the center of Epcot. So I've been trying to kind of re-clarify my thoughts on this over the last few days as I've been editing the video, so let me just say something extra real quick. It's not all negative, there are some positives to this area. But the problems for me really are these two things: the loss of any sense of character with how flat and generic it all looks, and particularly in the case of CommuniCore Hall, the loss of a space where more attractions could have gone, instead being torn down and used for a really cheap seating area. The end of Innoventions was drawn out and painful, and with the design changes that happened to it over time, I also think it was inevitable. Once the tech sponsors left and the pavilion shifted its focus towards this odd mix of environmental and health and safety education, it ended up losing a lot of its appeal, and the exhibits became much blander. There is definitely also a difficulty in building an attraction based around showcasing upcoming technology, because it has to be constantly updated, but I think it would have been possible had its original focus remained. I don't actually know if the change in focus was caused by Disney making a decision to do that, or if it was actually just the result of sponsors leaving, but whichever way it happened, I think that was the thing that ended up killing Innoventions. It's very sad what happened to it in its final years, and it's especially sad that it's now been replaced with so little. With the exception of the Journey of Water, there's nothing in the center of Epcot to actually do anymore. Theme parks need these smaller attractions to balance out the bigger ones, and I wish Disney had put some more effort into making something substantial to go here, rather than just phoning it in and making a waiting room. But anyway, what do you think about the end of Innoventions and its eventual replacements? Let me know in the comments. I'm very aware that some people didn't even like Innoventions in the first place, and they much preferred the original CommuniCore. Now, I personally don't hold any particular nostalgia for CommuniCore, as I wasn't around to experience it, so I didn't focus too much on that part of the Innoventions story in this video, but let me know your opinion about anything in the Innoventions timeline regardless. Other than that, if you're new here, please consider hitting subscribe so you don't miss future videos about theme parks coming soon, and as always, I'll see you next time.